So, welcome to my talk. I'm going to be talking a lot about front-end prototyping, so hopefully you get something out of this. So usually when I start a talk, I like to kind of start with a key question people always have. That is, how to pronounce my name. So this is kind of how you pronounce it, just in case you want to say hello to me. I'm not going to get mad if you mispronounce it, so it'll be cool. Currently where I'm at, I'm a design technologist at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. So my main role is to kind of build front-end tools for the data products team. So this is both building the actual design system, but also help scaling up the actual front-end prototyping efforts. Prior to that, I was at JustWorks, which is basically an HR company that provides a platform for small business owners. And then prior to that, I spent over 3 years building data products for NASDAQ. So now that we got that out the way, let's talk about what is a prototype. I'm betting that most of y'all have like kind of a different definition of what is a prototype. But for me, it's something simple as it's a sample application used to test and validate early concepts of a product. I highlight test and validate because I think in most cases we want to build stuff that users are actually going to use and it's actually solving an actual need for them. So we want to test and validate our designs as much as often. Another question you might ask is like, why do we create prototypes? Again, there's a million reasons why we create prototypes, but I'm going to highlight a few reasons. The first reason is to communicate ideas. I think when you're selling ideas, especially to stakeholders, a prototype is a very effective tool to kind of tell them, like show them the actual experience. Another thing is it uncovers edge cases. I'm a believer that the earlier you kind of design for these edge cases, the easier it's going to be. And especially when it gets down to where engineers are kind of building and kind of trying to retroactively solve these actual solutions, it gets kind of costly. Obviously, I think the other reason is like we want to test out the usability often and early, and this is what an actual prototype allows you to do. And finally, kind of to display different states, this is also in conjunction of when you have a component that has many different variants. So you want to actually show those variants in context of a screen, basically. So now that we talked about the what and why, let's talk about the different types of prototype. And there's two main prototypes that people are familiar with. The first one is a paper prototype. This is what I kind of worked on with one of my colleagues when I was at NASDAQ. We kind of were dealing with like a new project, so we decided to kind of use a paper prototype to make it easier for us to kind of build much more quickly and actually collaborate with each other. This is an example of a clickable prototype. So basically, again, this is an actual example from one of my former colleagues. And she did something interesting where she used PowerPoint to create an actual prototype. I was fascinated about this because I never want to touch PowerPoint ever. But this is good because especially in the corporate environment, a lot of people have access to PowerPoint. And in some cases, when I was at NASDAQ, a lot of things are like kind of blocked because of the firewall and all this other stuff. So we had to kind of be more flexible about what prototyping method we use. And last is kind of like Envision. Envision is a more robust prototyping platform because you're allowed to kind of do hotspots and whatnot. So now that we talked about the types, I want to talk about the pain points with these methods. Like I said, there's many pain points with these methods, but I'm going to kind of highlight 3. The first one is the creation of many artifacts. Back when I was actually like a web designer, I kind of did in a way where I was trying to version control my designs, and obviously you making sure that you want to be able to version control all the time, all the actual changes. So in some cases, it often look like this, where you have multiple final mockups. And then usually what ends up happening is that something happens and you actually have to kind of input that and put that back into the design. So rather than kind of saving over it, you kind of create this another final, and final too. And this also is problematic when you have like a big team. So in this graphic, we're basically showing like the progression of the correlation between the number of prototypes, but also the actual number of designers. So the more designers you get, the more prototypes you have. But what ends up happening is that it's often hard to find out which is the real actual prototype that people should be using. Another one is that it doesn't really stimulate the actual experience. Oftentimes when you're creating these static deliverables, you're very focused on the actual visuals of it, but not actually the interactions. And I definitely had a case where I was kind of building like this great visual design for this feature, but when it got to production, it was very lackluster. And the reason why, because in most cases, people are very focused on the actual visuals. They want to see like how it looks, but they don't really take that time to actually design the actual interactions and be able to incorporate some sort of animation to it. And another thing is that collaboration is hard. I think now we have better collaboration tools for designers. We have Figma and other tools. But back when I was trying to collaborate, especially when I was doing with Photoshop and Sketch, what often happens is when you're kind of collaborating with like another designer, you both of y'all basically kind of do it where you kind of design your own and then kind of merge your kind of designs into one file. And the progress and kind of making that happen is never quite right. It sometimes gets super awkward. And then you get in the mess where you're trying to basically merge these two files and you're not really doing anything that's very productive. So enter the front-end prototype. So what is a front-end prototype? It's pretty simple. It's basically a prototype that's built in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. This is basically the basic tools you need, but if you want to have a more robust front-end prototype, you could use other tools and incorporate other stuff. So the benefits of a front-end prototype. The main thing is that there's one master deliverable. One of the things what we did when I was at NASDAQ was that we had over 30 designers working on one product. The good thing about this was that we were using basically this type of method where we have one master prototype and basically kind of branch off of them. So this is kind of the same thing where if you're building a feature for a production and how engineers build their products. So the good thing about this is that in some cases, some of the actual features overlap with each other. And the only way we can actually kind of making sure that we use the same content and kind of like patterns is that if we had to kind of use it within building it with a front-end prototype. Another key thing I realized, especially working with a lot of data products, is that you want to be designing with real content and real data. Because there's been often times when you don't design with real data, and then once you kind of get into production, nothing really shows up. So my always suggestion is always ask for real content and data, and you always have to be persistent because in some cases it might be harder to do it depending on the company you work for. And kind of what I was talking about before, you'll be able to design for the actual real experience. So you'll be able to focus on all aspects from the actual visuals of it all the way to the animation and interaction design of the actual product. So some of you might have the question, how can you start today? I kind of thought about this and basically broke it down to 3 basic steps. The first step is creating code conventions, which is problematic for some developers because they like to kind of build their way. But I think with front-end prototyping, you need to have a common language and common way of like writing and building features because speed is the key. And if you're jumping from one project to another project, you don't essentially want to keep on relearning how people build stuff. Because if you have a common language, basically what's going to happen is it's going to be easier for you to kind of get started and get building features right away. After that, it's pretty much something more simpler where you have a style guide. And my methodology for using for this is like, these are more like the atomic CSS levels. So basically, you create classes that kind of like hold the colors and whatnot. And then you talk about pattern libraries, which I have another philosophy where is you use more of a scope like BEM structure, so you don't have that much leakage around it. And in some cases, you might not have a pattern library, but if you do, it makes it easier to kind of build quick prototypes in a timely fashion. So now that we talked about that, there's two main ways to kind of build front-end prototypes. There's the fast way, and there's the more robust and maintainable way. So as you can see here, we have basically an online playground. So we have CodePen, JS Fiddle, JS Bin. So usually when you're kind of building like something in the very quick, small components, it's better to kind of use these methods because it's much easier. But if you're trying to build a more robust front-end prototype, I recommend using a static site generator because I think they're very small and manageable, but they also have these cool things where you can kind of implement data within your markup with little effort. I'm a big fan of middleman, and I'm going to kind of walk through an example for that. So the first step is always to import the content. So kind of how I'm accustomed to do is that I usually have either a JSON or a YAML file basically with all the data that I want to kind of design around. And then once I kind of get that out the way, I add the content to the markup. The great thing about, I'm using Slim for this example, but the great thing about this is that you could do a lot of good things just kind of with very little code. So here I have a project where I'm gonna create a page that shows all the Justice League members. And this is what I get. So basically, the whole point for this is just kind of focus on the structure of it. So kind of like you're wireframing within the browser itself. And then second, you want to add some custom style to it. The good thing about working with these frameworks like Middleman and other stuff is that you can kind of apply specific classes to specific components based on name or any other sorts of data. So we have the instance where we're kind of doing a theme where we kind of show an image. All of this is done within when you kind of work with Slim and be able to kind of pull directly from the actual data file. And then finally, you can incorporate interactions. And I'm a big fan of like designers knowing how to code, but also building interactions with the medium, because it saves a lot of time to get a good understanding of like what works and what doesn't work for the browser itself. So as you can see here, all of them have this kind of this custom hover event, and that's only possible if you're building it where it's dynamic. Because if I was doing this with plain old HTML, it probably would take me twice as longer if I was not, building it with actual static site generator. So I know I only had 20 minutes, but here are some key takeaways. The one thing is to keep your front-end prototype simple. I think there's a battle between efficiency and speed, and I think in some cases you want to be as efficient as possible. But the thing is that with front-end prototype, speed is the key. And especially if you have a way where you have tight deadlines or whatever like that, you want to be able to actually have a way where you can kind of build something quick from concept to completion. Another thing is that I think there should be some sort of relationship between the prototypes and production. I know in some teams they use the actual CSS from their prototypes for production. In other teams, what they do is that they use the actual code from the prototypes as a benchmark that the engineers can kind of build off of. So either way, you want to kind of have some sort of way where it's beneficial for the engineers to kind of use the front-end prototype. And lastly, I think the idea should drive the prototype method. I will never subscribe or tell anyone to go from an idea straight into a front-end prototype. I think it should be kind of like a process. So basically what you want to do is kind of like, all right, is this idea, am I feeling very strong about this idea? If not, go through the progression of creating a paper prototype and then a clickable prototype, and then once you feel comfortable with the actual idea or solution, you can jump into the front-end prototype. There's tons of resources about front-end prototype itself, but I think these are kind of the top one. You should definitely check out the prototype playbook. There's a lot of examples like working with data with JavaScript and whatnot. And also, there's an article about like why prototypes should be mandatory. That's a great read too. And the master prototype. That's pretty much it. Thank you.